Okay, great. So we're going to get started. Welcome, everyone. My name is Laurel Wee. I am a member of the California Landscape Stewardship Network's Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Roundtable. And I'm really excited and honored to be moderating the Rising Leaders panel today. So the California Landscape Stewardship Network is a network of over 30 different stewardship collaboratives that encompass 40% of California and represent many different organizations, geographies, and partnership models. As a statewide network, we're able to focus broadly on systems level solutions and a collaborative landscape scale approach, rather than a specific place, stewardship practice, or project, and therefore defined by human connectivity, shared values, and common purposes. Our Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Roundtable for Healing Severed Connections is actively collaborating to create tools, approaches, and meaningful conversation that help evolve the work of landscape conservation to be more inclusive, equitable, and culturally relevant. Our Equity Leaders Speaker Series is designed to bring conversations to life about how we can all work with justice and belonging as our core values. So I'm excited to introduce our 4 different panelists today. And after I share each panelist's bio, they'll be answering our first question about what inspired them to work at the intersection of environmental conservation and social justice. So first, we have Barbara Camacho Garcia, who is an ecologist, environmental educator, project lead at the environmental nonprofit Grassroots Ecology. Barbara was born in Teocaltiche, Mexico, and moved to Sacramento, California as a child. And as a first-generation college student, Barbara graduated from UC Berkeley with a degree in forestry and natural resources. She especially loves hosting naturalist events in Spanish and connecting nature to celebration like Dia de los Muertos alongside community partners. So thank you for joining us, Barbara.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here and just sharing a little bit about how I was inspired to join this field. I think definitely growing up in a very small town in Mexico, like it was just embedded into like such a very community-driven place that like we depend on nature so much, and it was always such a lesson from my parents to like always respect it. So from that, I think the culture shock of moving to then like a big city like Sacramento, and like even within that grew up very low income where like most of my surrounding was concrete, that I realized there's such a big difference in like who has access to the outdoors, who has how environmental justice impacts all of us. And that really inspired me to then, when I went to college, to focus my career on something like community-based restoration, where like people are able to like really have an active part in their community, and then also like the solution to climate change. Like I remember this quote by Chico Mendes that's like, ecology without class struggle is just gardening. And I feel like I really cling on to that as like, it really, in order to really make meaningful change, like we need to include everyone. And I've been really mission driven from then on to have a career where I'm able to be very community interfacing and also inspire people to connect with their land.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I love that tie to how important the people connection with the environment is. So next up, we have Ben Chang, who is a California Climate Action Corps Fellow in Northern California, focused on resolving the environmental and social issue that is catastrophic California wildfires. Ben's focus is primarily on restoring fire-dependent forest ecologies, and Ben believes that low-intensity fire on the land is good and that people can be hands-on with climate and wildfire issues that they are passionate about, and that ordinary people can do extraordinary things for the environment. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ben. And we'll have Ben answer what inspired him to start this work.
Oh, right. Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, I am an ordinary person. I really believe in the work I do, and I got it all started kind of quite by accident. A long time ago, I was in a similar path. I was in recreation administration, really focused on creating social equity and outdoor recreation, and really trying to create opportunities for all people of all backgrounds to have the enriching experience of being in the outdoors. And one day, a wildfire started burning up to a place I loved very dearly. And I almost lost that entire place, this beautiful 2,000-acre property that people come to and visit and camp at in Mendocino County, which I work at today. And I remember feeling kind of devastated about going to bed that night and feeling like tomorrow I'm going to wake up and everything I love was going to be gone from the wildfire. Well, in the middle of the night, the wind changed and the fire did not burn over the place I loved. And that next day, I just had this sense of like, there has to be a reason this happens. Wildfire isn't getting bigger by acres and longer in longer seasons because of just nature. There's got to be a reason. And in researching and discovering what it was really a conglomeration of forest mismanagement, preclusion of fire from the forest ecology, and all exacerbated by climate change. And I was just so determined to be the answer that the thing we needed in order to respond to this environmental and social issue. It's obviously horrible ecologically to have this level of hot, intense fire burning over the landscape, but also socially, there's something going on here where those who are most impacted are generally people of lower socioeconomic status. And we know this, and it's a theory that's well known and something that I learned from something I did previously, which was doing hurricane relief work back in the Southeast, and knowing that people who were most impacted by hurricanes were in fact people who were most vulnerable. So understanding that theory, applying it to new landscapes and social and environmental issues that I'm passionate about at the time. But that's how I got involved.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Ben. Next up, we have Irene Takako Farr, who brings expertise in environmental policy research and implementation related to the topics of land use, wildfire, waste, oceans and coasts, and labor. At Better Worlds Group, she brings her skills in strategy and design to build client policies that are centered on community expertise. Prior to joining Better Worlds Group, Irene explored climate justice in the context of urban planning, transportation, and labor as a UCLA research assistant. Thank you for joining us, Irene.
Thank you, and good afternoon. It's really nice to share space with you all and to meet you all. My name is Irene Takako Farr. I am based in Los Angeles. I grew up in Los Angeles on Tongva land. And I actually grew up in San Pedro, California, just south of LA by the oil refineries and the LA and Long Beach ports. So I think just growing up, I knew that there were some real health and environmental impacts from that proximity and that it wasn't normal. But I wasn't able to name it until a social geography class I took in college, where I started to realize that there had been land use decisions made to intentionally burden certain communities and benefit others, and specifically burden communities like mine more than others. And I was pursuing a degree in environmental science at the time. And at the schools that I went to, there was such a focus on environmental conservation, and that focus really divorced people from the conversation and excluded people. So I felt like there was something missing from that puzzle. And so the vision that I really try to bring to my work now is to be part of a movement that shifts how we think about and develop an environmental and implement environmental policy in a way that really follows the leadership and like decades and generations of work that have been led by tribes and environmental justice communities already, and also supports their health and beneficial outcomes. So thank you again.
Thank you. Our fourth panelist is Ivette Torres, who is a lifelong resident of Moreno Valley and is passionate about challenging norms in academia and advocating for community-led research. She has been involved with research at University California Riverside and has led air monitoring studies focusing on the air quality on the west side of San Bernardino. In her free time, Ivette loves to take pictures of nature and spend time outdoors in local reservoirs. So thank you, Ivette, for joining us today.
Hi, y'all. Thanks. Similar to some of the folks that already talked, actually, like Irene, I've grown up in an environmental justice community. So Moreno Valley is part of the Inland Empire, and we actually have a huge influx of logistics hubs. So these are millions of square feet of warehousing that are the norm. I would say it's like a Starbucks. You see these spaces of warehouses that have trucks, around thousands and thousands of trucks, heavy duty trucks with diesel exhaust coming in and out of our communities, as well as freight rail and freight airports. And I think that has played a huge part in the fact that we're losing a lot of our outdoor space to these warehouses. The IE is very unique I can't say that word. Geographically. We are surrounded by mountains and hills. And so I think we all are really lucky where we've had this hill that we've grown up with right behind us, whether you're in Moreno Valley and Drupa Valley, San Bernardino, Fontana, or Riverside. But a lot of those areas are really taken up by logistics. And so getting to the outdoor space or being outdoors becoming very difficult, one, because we have one of the worst air quality in the nation. And so it's kind of hard to say to young children, like, you can't be outside, you can't enjoy the outdoors because you're going to end up hurting yourself. And so I think understanding that and growing up, seeing that, why did I have these symptoms? Why did others around me have symptoms like asthma and allergies, headaches? And we weren't really allowed to be outside. I think has really pushed for that intersection, right? It's like, how do we remediate the land that we still have and protect that, right? And bring more of that opportunity outdoors.
Great, thank you. Yeah, thank you all so much for sharing what inspired you to get into this field. I'm really grateful for all of you joining us today and just the work that you do overall to help improve our environments for the communities that we're working within. So for our next question, each of you has participated in different programs that provided you with professional training and experience in collaboration, from leadership to academic programs. So we would like if you could share some of your background on those programs you enrolled in and some of the valuable experiences you gained from them. So as what kind of helped you develop in this career path?
Yeah, I'm happy to share about a fellowship that I did with Justice Outside as part of the Rising Leaders Fellowship. And yeah, highly recommend if anyone's familiar with Justice Outside. They're a really amazing organization that really try to center racial equity into environmental groups. And it was really amazing just to be surrounded by a cohort of like-minded people. And together we learned a lot of things, from trauma-informed care and how to incorporate that into our programming, to the racism behind philanthropy and how to grapple with that working in a nonprofit. And so I think all those tools really helped me grow into more of a leadership role. And part of that as well was having a project to bring back to your organization to be more equitable. And so the project that I focused on was how to, it was like a safety protocol, decentering the police from our safety guidelines, and having different resources for things that make sense not to go to the police to. And so that was one of the ways that I was able to kind of give or make some change in my organization, but also just really made me comfortable with the confidence, the language, and I think ultimately the network of knowing who to lean on for different resources. And yeah, it was really amazing.
I'm currently a member, I'm a fellow of this program called California Climate Action Corps. It's California based. It's a program where you can do an 11-month fellowship or a summertime fellowship, and they pair you with an organization that is of your interest. So there's a lot of different facets to climate related work. I also happen to work in wildfire and forest health, but there is urban greening, food waste and recovery, and a few others. I so happen to focus on wildfire because I'm passionate about it, and it's something more outdoors related, and forest ecology is something that I really pay attention to. But what's great about this organization is it gives you, as an individual, basically a full-time job, and you'll be paired with an organization like an intern, but you still get training and support from California Climate Action Corps. You get a salary for the year, a lot of benefits as well. And the other thing is it's your time to kind of network and talk to other fellows, figure out what they're doing in the sector that you're most interested in. I think one thing that I learned from this experience doing it for the last 2 seasons was that climate work is really all encompassing. Climate work now is all facets of our lives, not just, the outside edge or the kind of the left swinging environmental movement. It very much is everybody's impacted with environmental issues, including people like in what wild or wilderness areas like where I'm at. We really didn't think wildfire was going to be exacerbated by climate change, but 20 years later, here we are, and now we're learning to deal with it. So California Climate Action Corps is a great organization. Look them up if you can. And also, I think the other thing I'm involved with is I recently entered into a graduate degree in wildlife management at CSU Chico, which is a great program for those of you who are interested in more of the social and kind of collaborative side of wildfire and prescribed burning. And if you're interested in fire or in a graduate degree related to something fire related, that's a really great way to kind of learn and understand how to be a leader or even a strong follower in the field of community wildfire resilience.
Thank you.
Oh, I can go too. I wasn't sure if I read. But yeah, I think a big piece, like folks have mentioned, is looking out for programs that you could apply to. If you're in school, whether it's a community college, Cal State or UC or a private entity, we're really lucky that at least in California, a lot of the higher ed systems now are really centering or have some sort of like sustainability office, if not like an equity and sustainability office. When I was in Santa Cruz, I was really lucky to be a part of this. It was called it was centering students of color's voices in sustainability. And so that really kind of opened my door into it can be, we need those interactions. We need to talk about the environment and sustainability, but have that social justice and climate justice equity voice in there. Because I know at times for folks that may not be familiar with that vocabulary or familiar with those spaces and can feel very off-putting or very white or very just enviro. And I know a lot of folks have been doing great work to make spaces not feel like that anymore, right? Like this series, these programs like the JEDI, because it's important, as Ben was saying, climate justice, right? Climate is impacting everyone. And so I would say trying to get involved in any way you can. And if you're not in any academic setting, hopefully you have a local organization. Even Sierra Club is like a great first start. I started as a Sierra Club volunteer actually in the IE, but I was really lucky that the Sierra Club in the Inland Empire worked really closely with the EJ groups. And so that kind of led, like that path led me into working and now being really in the EJ space was my community, right? So I think it really depends on where you can see yourself learning from, right? And just getting yourself in opportunities is really important to finding out what is the right fit.
Thank you.
And just to wrap us up and also I think connect to what Ivette was sharing, I feel like the most valuable experiences I've had have like allowed me to explore relationships like for myself on a personal level, but also like within my sector and role, and also like build opportunities to have partnerships across different spaces that I might not normally be in. So I recently completed a fellowship called New Leaders Council. That's a national free leadership opportunity that really focuses on place-based leaders and building capacity and exchange across those folks. And I also had an opportunity to go back to grad school like Ben and completed my degree in urban planning. And I think from there was really able to learn more about the opportunity and like process of building policy from bottom up instead of top down. And also got to really explore like the different intersections of land use with environment, but also labor and transportation and housing. So I don't know, maybe that's why I'm kind of like a generalist now, but definitely really enjoy like all the opportunities there are in all the different spaces and trying to figure out like how I can be involved there.
Excellent. Thank you all for sharing. So I just want to remind the audience right now that if you have any questions that you would like us to pose to the panelists during the audience question section later on. Please feel free to drop that in the Q&A and we will answer those later. And that the session is being recorded. I know you've probably seen that in the chat. So our next question is, what do each of you see as one of the most challenging aspects of your work? And where could you see areas for greater support as emerging leaders to solve some of those challenges?
I think the one thing that I've noticed in the last couple of years when pursuing this as a career is, this work is relatively new, and a lot of people do a really good job of funneling you into something like, oh, you work in forest health. Well, what does that mean? Like, you're a forester, you're in logging, you're in resource extraction, it kind of progresses very quickly when you don't steer the conversation. I don't say conservation in the work I do. I think conservation is very human centric. I think it's not exactly what I believe in. I think forest health is really what I believe in, looking at forests from more of an ecologically centered place for fire. And so I think the thing I'm struggling with, and I think a lot of people struggle with when you're in these sorts of careers or in climate work, is that a lot of people don't know exactly what you're doing. And it's really hard to explain sometimes where you're coming from because the work is so new. This is also not a bad thing in any stretch. This is actually a very good thing. And a lot of times when you're given the platform, you can really express what you're doing and why you believe in it and relate it to people, meet them where they're at. Oftentimes people are actually impacted by these things that you're already working on. And so they understand generally. The other thing I will say is a lot of school programs, again, funnel you in. If I studied forestry back in the day, I probably would have gone into like timber extraction or resource extraction. I wouldn't have gone into wildfire. It's relatively new. But at the same time, I think the one thing I'm a huge advocate for is allowing yourself to be self-taught, allowing your lived experiences actually be informative and educational, and using those in your professional career rather than always focusing on professional things you've done or educations that you've received.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. I love how you touched on like the importance of communication and being empathetic and personable within our work. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Barbara.
I was going to mention, like, I think the role of like being so intertwined with the community work that we're doing out with volunteering, I think it's important to also address, like, there's so many barriers that people have to volunteering. And I think it's a challenge to try to reduce some of those barriers when it's so deeply embedded in like structural racism of like how close a park is to you. So I would say the challenging part is definitely kind of removing those barriers, whether that's like transportation, incentivizing people to come out with either like stipends or like providing food. So I think all that are some ways that we're currently like really working towards making sure that people can come to our programming regardless of their background. But I would say additionally with that, I think funding is also really challenging. Like, I think right now there's a push, and like I think it's gotten to this point where like environmental justice needs to be centered in like all environmental conversations. And I think the future is really where we're going to see if this momentum will be reliable, or if it's just kind of like a trendy thing for now and then the funding will disappear. So I feel like the challenging part is this like future planning for how to center environmental justice in our work.
Yeah, I think Barbara really touched on that, is that the funding and capacity when you're working with community is extremely important. And I think something that I see a lot in the work that I do, that we do, is that at times, like this idea of working with community, whether it's through an academic lens or environmental groups coming in for the first time, it's more like a check mark, even industry right now, right? Because the funding is very like infrastructure money that's coming in into California, right? That can be used to bring more green spaces and electrifying our communities. You have these groups that are traditionally the ones who have been hurting communities and hurting our environments, wanting to apply for these type of fundings and kind of using community groups as a check mark. And I think that's that is a big challenge. This is not the way to make that change. We do need to work together and in a huge holistic way, but it's not by just using community and community groups as a check mark. We really need to listen to the folks on the ground dealing with these day-to-day impacts of the climate crisis that's happening now already, right? I think a lot of times too, when we're talking about it at the policy level or the funding level, we talk about it as something that's coming in the next 10 years, but we see, right, that it's already happening to many Indigenous and communities of color across the US, across the world. And so the impacts are here. People are feeling these impacts and really working with those on the ground and those who are going to deal firsthand with these impacts or are dealing with them, and listening to them. They're experts, whether you don't need to have that academic background to be an expert or the policy background. And I think that's one of the bigger issues that we tend to have, is that the funding is like, well, let's go with the industry or the academic. And it's like, but these are the folks on the ground. And so I think, Ben and Barbara really touched on that. It's like the way we look at how we work with community or how we work with the environment around us is extremely important in the next 20 years to come, now to 20.
And again, just to wrap this question up, I forgot to mention before that, so I work for Better World Group and we're a mission-based consulting firm. And so as a consultant, my role is often to bring like government and philanthropy to the table with environmental justice communities and tribes. And I feel like in environmental policy and environmental justice, a lot of people agree about what needs to the desired outcome, but probably disagree about what the best solution is. And so I think building consensus is definitely a challenge, especially considering the legal and political and funding barriers that other folks have talked about as well. But also something that I would like to see more of, especially when we're thinking about solutions, is like step up and step back, which is a term that people use a lot in facilitation, but also should apply to how we're making decisions and building power across the whole community of folks that are really trying to create a solution altogether.
Thank you all so much for sharing some of the challenges, but also some of the solutions and areas of support. It's definitely a big part of some of what the roundtable focuses on, is how can we really look at some of these issues from a systems level and bring people into these conversations who don't always have the power, and how can we give from our stance and our work some of that power to others. So for our next question, we're switching to kind of like whatever panelist wants to answer, and maybe not every person will answer it, but maybe if we could start with you, Irene, I think that could be great. So just as you are all in your careers, you've gotten going, you're emerging leaders. What are some skills that you think that other people entering this field should work on developing to help them be successful?
Yeah, I guess just speaking from personal experience, a lot of what we do at my firm is coalition building and also facilitating conversations across folks from different parts of the same sector to identify maybe some collective actions or shared solutions. So in my line of work, definitely facilitation has been a skill that I've really had to grow on and rely on pretty heavily. And then also like conflict resolution, it has been pretty important.
Thank you.
A skill that I value a lot, especially when I meet young professionals or people who come work for me, is people who are curious and interested, and who can, who begin to start understanding what is not being done versus what already is being done. I think a lot of people kind of like a track of knowing what's going to happen in front of them, but also equally so when you're a young professional, it's really important to just figure out what's not being done yet in that field that you're doing. Be innovative, be different. One thing you may have noticed in my bio, there was no reference to any type of formal education background of any kind. And I intentionally did that because me and wildfire, me and forestry is all self-taught. This is something that I picked up because I discovered that it was something I was interested in, and I was already done with school. And it's something that I think young professionals should think about when you're entering the field, learn how to be self-taught, learn how to retool your skill sets or learn new things, talk to people, go to conferences, meet new people, ask the right questions, and read things off the internet. I think it is a really great skill to really, especially in small organizations, become invaluable because you can do so many different things.
Thank you.
I definitely agree. Being willing to learn, whether that's in an academic path or non-academic, at our organization and in a lot of other EJ orgs, a lot of our folks that work with us, who are organizers or policy or promotores, don't have like academic background. It's just they had that willingness to want to work in their community or with other communities that are, dealing with these environmental impacts and consequences. And so I think a big part is developing that skill set to allow yourself to learn, and also not comparing your journey to others, right? That's, I think, so essential, mostly as we are living in this internet world. You may see folks that you have grown up with already in school or in higher education, graduate school, but we all have our own journeys. And I think this work is really about that. It's like, how do you develop as a person, but also allow that to work for the collective, right? So it's really great if you can find your passion and working with the environment, working with the community. But I think a big part is like definitely understanding we all have our own journeys and being open to that.
Thank you. I don't know if Barbara, if you want to share any skills, but you could also bring it up.
I can share. I think for me, I was very introverted, and then to step into a role where so much of it is just like cold calling, cold emailing organizations and like meeting with them face to face and like having these conversations on how to further develop that relationship. I think the skill that has helped me the most is just being okay with being uncomfortable. So like putting yourself out there. And I think a lot of the like listening skills of like hearing them for what they're saying and being able to compromise and like meet halfway and really meet the community where they're at. It took a lot of skills on my end to like be able to listen for that, and also be uncomfortable with being the person to reach out, or even just using my network to be like, oh, hey, this person. Like, I think that is really what has been really successful about creating relationships in the East Palo Alto community in particular, is just being there.
Yeah, thank you all so much for sharing. So just another reminder for our audience, we'll be doing audience questions pretty soon. So if you have any questions for any of our panelists, if it was for a specific panelist, you can mention that in your question. But yeah, feel free to drop that in the Q&A section that's at probably the bottom of your Zoom window. So feel free to add that in. Great. So our next question for our panelists are, what are are there examples in your work that you could share that show how folks can move beyond performative gestures to include more expressions of equality and justice in this work? So I know earlier, Ivette was talking about, we need to move beyond just like checking the box, getting hands-on in our work and making sure that we're actually listening to our community and the people we're collaborating with. So yeah, how can people move beyond those performative gestures of like checking the box to just get it done and make sure that it actually is including equity and justice?
I think at the very, very minimum, obviously, like looking internally and thinking about what policies need to be built there to support like external environmental justice JEDI work is important. And as organizations are building processes or programs, really looking at the recommendations that community members have provided but also not starting from zero. So like looking at the work that community members and CBOs have done already around the issue area and how they can leverage and support that. And I think other folks on this call also mentioned compensation and really valuing community member input as like community expertise and giving power to that. And then another thing that I really think is important for like moving beyond performative gestures is making commitments to that work, but also not overpromising and making sure that what you're committing to is something that you'll follow through on so that you can build trust and really like show support and mean it in the way that you're implementing your JEDI work.
From a volunteer perspective, I work with a lot of volunteers, and I've been a volunteer with a lot of organizations. It seems like volunteers are used to kind of do busy work almost. But I think the thing that I've tried to do in the last couple of years is really create meaningful work for volunteers to do and begin to use that to begin having a narrative about the issue, the environmental or social issue that we're faced with. And then from there, have people empathize with people who are, you know, less fortunate from them that they may be serving. I think it's really easy to do volunteer work because you need hours. I think it's really easy to do volunteer work because it's fun. Oftentimes, how do you create volunteer work that is meaningful and then make it fun versus creating volunteer work that's already fun, but it's not that meaningful? And there's a lot of examples growing up where I was doing things that at the time I thought was really helpful, but to a community that was receiving the assistance, it wasn't really much. Or it didn't change their lives in a way that allowed them to uplift themselves, right? It really created just an opportunity for me to help. And those are sorts of opportunities that I'm keenly aware of. There's a book out there that I heard about, and I think I've read parts of it. It's called When Helping Hurts. And it's about basically charitable organizations wanting to give. And the problem with that model is it's not helping people to, you know, uplift themselves long term. So it creates kind of a perpetual cycle of us needing to assist other people. And that's not necessarily a bad thing all the time, but in my work of wildfire, I think the issue that I'm having is a lot of people also don't really understand it. It's a complex issue. And so the volunteers that I receive, that I work with, I'm trying to help them understand, you know, the 3 points of wildfire, why it's an issue with mismanagement of forest resources, preclusion of wildfire from the forest ecology, and exacerbated by climate change. How can I create an experience that gets people to start thinking about that narrative, start deconstructing the red hot orange glow they see on the news, and really start questioning their environment and what's going on, and maybe asking themselves what I can do to be a part of the solution. Of course, that's not going to happen overnight. And I think the thing I will say is it's took me a couple of years to figure that out. But the idea is, how can you create volunteer experiences for volunteers if you choose to work with them in your career? How can you create meaningful volunteer experiences that help people not only do something and give back, but also change their thinking and help them be more in the solution with how they consume resources, how they consume the environment as a consumer of products, but also how they choose to live.
I think too, just like sharing for my organization, like having a DEI plan is very much like the first step, but then like actually implementing what we promised on. So things like going beyond land acknowledgements and really kind of centering as stewards of the land that we weren't the first original stewards, and centering that in our education programs. Going beyond like just saying we want to have more families of immigrants come to our programming, and like actually carry that out by paying our staff who are bilingual, like for the skill set of speaking Spanish, and allowing for us to meet that goal in that way. So like really putting our money where our mouth is. And also I think having events like either, whether it's resources like staff where we're able to have affinity groups in our volunteer session. So like things like LGBTQ plus events or bilingual events. I think those are all really good ways of how to move beyond just like performative gestures, and like really make sure that everyone who comes to our events feel like it's accessible for them and included in the environment, and like see themselves as like a volunteer.
Yeah, just if we have time to add, just adding that compensation is super important, like whether that's paying community to give up a Saturday morning, that's a lot, right? Most folks work or an afternoon or an evening, so any type of compensation is important. I think for us too, we listen to community, at least in the organization. How we work is, if community wants to work on a topic or a warehouse or rail or electrification, or just have a day where we're outdoors, that's kind of how we move. And so really allowing yourselves to listen to the community and compensate them too. Like we've had conversations where researchers want to come in and do data work, for example, like air quality monitoring. And it's like, you can't just come in and do that. Like, what are you going to do that? I mean, honestly, air quality monitoring is super important, right? But are we going to certify the community that does this? Like, how can we give them also a skill set and tool set? Will they have access to this data? I think that's also a piece that's super important in the environmental research bucket. As more environmental research is being funded, like communities and tribal communities should have ownership to that data. I think we need to start looking at those research questions of climate impacts, and what way can we protect those communities, but also, and I say protect because communities have a skill set that they've been doing for years, right? Mostly our indigenous communities, they've worked with these lands, they tend these lands, they know what works. But kind of ensuring that folks are getting compensated for that financially, but also with certificate training. Mostly, I think on the labor piece, like that's another aspect that's super important when we're having these conversations. It's like labor justice is as important to climate justice and environmental justice and the environmental work that we're doing. We need to have opportunities to train the next generation, but also the I would say what we would call like the retired generation. And I share this because in like the work I do, electrification is a big conversation. So if you have someone that has been doing one job their whole lives, and now everything's electrified and they're like at 60 almost to retire, but not retired and still need a job, it's like we can't leave folks behind. So being intergenerational too in the work that we're doing, I think is so important. But yeah, just kind of wanted to add that little bit.
Thank you so much. I think everyone answered that one. Right. If you haven't and want to speak up, let me know. But yeah, so we're going to move on to some of our audience questions. Thank you all so much for sharing your answers for that last one. So for this question, it is, which accomplishment, one or two of them, that you're most pleased with so far? Do you want to start us off, Ivette?
I can. I guess interpersonal, I would say I'm just really glad that I've been able to work with my community. Like, not a lot of people have that privilege and opportunity to stay in a community they've grown up in and get to work side by side with community members and the next generation. And I think, to me, that's something I'm so thankful for. That I would see that as an accomplishment. And I think on a more like organizational or just community level is, I think that the grit that I see so many community members have, at least we continue to see warehouses being approved and expanded, but that doesn't stop a lot of folks from the fight. And a lot of these people, a lot of these community members are, they have their 9 to 5 or their 12 to 10, depending if they work where they're working at, right? And they still make that time. And I just have so much like heart, and I'm so proud of the folks that are doing this. And I think on a voluntary basis, right? We were talking about volunteers. I need to acknowledge my privilege that I get paid to do this work. So that's important too, right? So just, yeah, I think that's one thing I'm really proud of, that I've gotten to be able to work within my community, and not many can say that.
The work I do is very big picture. Sometimes I think it's really easy to talk about wildfire and say, we need to do this, we need to do that. But, or, those communities need to, because they're in the forest, they need to live a different way. And I think the thing that I'm very lucky to do is, while I get to think more big picture, I still work in the forest. This is just an office building outside. It's a 2,000-acre forest I'm on. This morning I was pole sawing using a chainsaw to trim trees. Wore boots and pants, and then I took a shower, came here to do this conversation. And so I get to still work on the front lines with volunteers in the forest. I use fire on the land in the wintertime as a prescribed burn tool. And so I'm very much hands-on with the process of creating forests that are ready for fire and fire-dependent forest ecologies. But likewise, when I'm not doing that, I get to turn around and talk to people, get to experience the professional related career fields and really collaborate with different people. And that level of connection between the front line of working in the field, working with people, and then coming back and kind of looking at it from a big picture is something really important, I feel, for myself and I think emerging leaders as well. Because oftentimes the people at the top do not have a fundamental understanding of folks at the bottom of the workforce. So that's really important. And I'm really proud that I spend my time splitting my time between those two areas.
And I think for me, I think being on the ground, in the field, being able to see, the park that I work at used to be a landfill. And it's there's such a history of landfills and polluting factories being placed systematically, in communities of color, low-income communities. And so being able to be part of the restoration of something that used to be a landfill to then something beautiful, and see so many people who come and are able to recreate in this space, and also to see the plants grow and really start to provide habitat for different pollinators and birds, and a lot of wildlife. I think seeing that life come back into a place that was a dump has been so fulfilling, and I think it's one of my biggest accomplishments.
And for myself, I think just following the thread that you all laid ahead too, I think it's just an enormous privilege to be able to have these conversations in new spaces like today, but also day to day in my work, and to have the opportunity to meet with so many different people that are coming to the table with a different perspective, and think about what is a path forward, and how do we solve this puzzle together. So definitely the opportunity to think about things intersectionally, and also from a community perspective, and then Ben was sharing from a very nature perspective as well, and giving respect to both of those different ways of thinking has been a privilege, and definitely something I always wanted to do when I was growing up. And so definitely feels like a big accomplishment to be here now.
Great, thank you both so much. So we have another question. So this might not pertain to all of you, so just unmute if you're one of the ones that wants to answer it. But do your organizations have connections to large state and federal entities? And what does that interface look like now, and how could it be improved?
Yes. We work with a lot of the air quality agencies. So at the local level, we have our local air district. At the state level, we have what is the California Air Resources Board. And at the federal level, we have EPA. And so I think that relationship is super important, right? Because the policymakers, the staff, the researchers at these different entities really need to see and understand the day-to-day that communities are living, that live with these industrial and fossil fuel impacts, right? They need to understand what's happening, not with the community members, but the land around. And, it's pretty upsetting when you're working with someone who, let's say, lives in Washington, D.C., and they've never been to California, and they think they're doing the best work they can to help remediate with policy. And it's like, I'm sorry, but you're not living the day to day. And so I think that's why it gets so important to have those relationships. I think it also touches base on kind of the question earlier of the compensation and capacity. Unfortunately, the fossil fuel companies have lobbyists, they have other resources. So it's how they kind of obtain land too. I think one thing we really have been wanting to work with is to work with these entities, to work with our state and local government to obtain land for community, right? To have more trails, to have more green, more farms, because that's also a part of remediation, is giving that land back, right? That's for that stewardship. But it is important to have that relationship, and it's a little difficult to navigate when others around you have more of those resources and that capacity building to work with these entities. Plus, it's 3 different entities you're dealing with. It's local, state, and federal. And when you're talking about those entities, there's also communities very different from yours, right? So you have to be in communication, because we have to work together. We can't work in silo, but also at the same time, communities do look different, right? My community may not look the same as Barbara's or Ben's or Irene's or Laurel's. And so as we're working with these entities, like working together and having this combined goals and mindsets, but understanding those differences too is super important when navigating that.
Thank you. So like what might look better for those connections will look different depending on the community, and yeah, always keeping that in mind as well. Thank you so much for answering that one, Yvette. So for our next question, someone who's really intrigued about the idea of compensation specifically for volunteers is asking, what might this look like, and how do we keep from veering into the world of work and volunteers being treated as workers?
I think, yeah, definitely working with volunteers in different capacities. Like one tool that I see like our partner organization do is like transportation funding. So whether that's paying for like bus fares for people to get to where you're volunteering, to like having gift cards for them, even if it's just like a $50 Target gift card, just to feel like I think that still maintain that separation of like not treating them as workers, but also I think just compensating them for being there. And that can also include like snacks and providing like different incentives for people to come. But I think that would really be helpful.
I think working with volunteers is a really fascinating thing. It's like, it's a whole other panel discussion we could have, right? In all the organizations I've represented, like we all use volunteers differently, some really well and some not so well. I think in terms of compensation for volunteers, there's like a ton of things you can do. The most important thing I feel is like making a volunteer feel valued, right? Their time is a finite resource, and to get their time for an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours once a year, once a week, once a month is invaluable. And from a small nonprofit organization, having volunteers that can do work, is something that, takes work off of a professional who might have to do it. One of the compensations that I think works the best is just feeding your volunteers, right? If you're on a weekend morning, bagels, donuts, coffee, providing lunch after the work is done. A lot of times, some of the executive directors I've worked for in the past would say like, yeah, let's buy extra food so they can volunteers can take food home. When taking food home, that's providing them value later on that, that isn't directly associated with being at that volunteer event. So that could be helpful. I have overnight volunteer events, so providing lodging, providing food throughout the weekend if they're choosing to be there, and then sometimes giving them a t-shirt. I mean, it's really all about making people feel like they're valued. And then again, it's mostly just non-monetary transactions. It's mostly food and stuff. That works in my organization. It's not always the answer.
Yeah, thank you both so much for sharing some of that. So we only have about 3 minutes left before we do a little closeout, but just to, I really am so grateful for all the work people do. I'm really inspired myself just hearing all of you mention what got you into this work, what some of the challenges are, but where we could build from that. And then, hearing the different accomplishments that you are seeing, in your own personal pathways in this career, and then also just through the work that you're doing as well. So I was hoping that we could end on this last question of what are some tools that you go to for fun, adventure, enjoy yourself? You know, it's such an important part. This is hard work. It's not easy. And I am so amazed by what you all do. So what is something you do to have joy in your life and adventure?
Yeah, I work outdoors. I, grew up not really outdoor recreating, got into outdoor recreation, mountain bike a little bit. Very privileged to be in a community that values that empowered that I'm able to do it. I'm privileged enough to be affluent to enjoy the outdoors. And so much so that I made it into a career. And I've been working outside for a long time. Still working in an office a lot, answer emails all the time, but sometimes sitting inside is appealing. But one thing I will say about this question in particular is now I'm at the point in my life where I really love sharing what I do with my people, my family, my partner, people who enjoy spending time with me, whatever it might be. I think I have gotten to the point where what I do is now my professional skill set, and it's what I do. And it doesn't take the edge off entirely, but finding new meaning in doing those things, not just for myself intrinsically, but sharing that with other people. It's been really valuable in my life, sharing the experiences I have hiking off trail and showing people beautiful trees and forest ecologies that you wouldn't normally see, to people who wouldn't see those things, including, my 3-year-old nephew and my older sister, and people that, don't exactly have that understanding yet. That's been really valuable for me.
And for me, I feel like growing up, like I never really had representation of environmentalists who looked like me or sounded like me or had a similar life story than I did. And I think now being in the role of like educating the next generation, and just seeing like how like the kids' eyes light up when I say that I speak Spanish and I can communicate with them, especially serving like a lot of recently immigrated families. And I think just like, for example, we had a program this summer with Boys and Girls Club that was local to East Palo Alto, and engaging with them and like seeing the kids come back after the program ended with their families and like showing them all the different things that they learned and like being in the park. All of that really brought me a lot of joy. And I think in maintaining that so that I don't get burnt out is another big chapter of like learning to say no has been really good in keeping the momentum going. But outside of work, I think a lot of it is just like deepening my own relationship with nature and like tending to like my own backyard and going outside, hiking and like exploring new places. All of that has really been really joyful.
Yeah, I think like the power to say no is definitely like, just to go back to the earlier question about skill sets in this career path, I think is super important. And really supports rest. And as far as tools go, I think for me, I tend to be like a builder. So just like, even just like a pen and paper where I get to like write out some thoughts or just do some creative writing has been really supportive to me having rest.
We're close to wrapping it up. So Ivette, if you have a quick
Oh, yeah.
thing that brings you joy. Yeah.
Acknowledging what folks have said, definitely balance is so important. So creating some sort of balance, I think definitely for me, what has helped is trying to find that balance with, because my work does bring me joy, but knowing that that doesn't mean I should always be working, and spending that time outside or with family is super important. Just or even by yourself to like get that energy right. Some folks really need that time alone. But yeah, I think echoing what folks have said, just finding that balance. For me, definitely it is being outside, and mostly in a place like the IE where a lot of folks kind of don't acknowledge the beauty of what is Inland Empire. So I love purposely showcasing how beautiful it is.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. We're
Can
gonna
I offer one more strategy that might be different or interesting to some people?
Sure, if it's quick, we gotta wrap
real
it
fast.
up, but yeah.
So one thing that I started doing only a few years ago is I started seeking out the things that I was bad at and started pursuing those things. And the reason why is a lot of times when you're a young professional or you're emerging professional, or even if you've been into your career, you know a lot of stuff. You know everything. You're the know-it-all. But sometimes it's really fun to change that perspective and try something that you don't know, or learn from a perspective you don't have. And I've done a lot of that with different hobbies, but also with some of the knowledge, some of the work that I do. And that has allowed me to be a student again and learn from other people. And that's been really fun for me to grow professionally, is to try learning again from somebody else's perspective, from being not the teacher, but now just being a student. So finding something that you're probably bad at and learning that.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, well, thank you all. We're at time, but I appreciate, thank you to all our panelists and all our attendees. If you want to reach out, if you have any other questions, feel free to do so. Panelists, just a heads up, you're getting lots of love in the chat, so check that out. But yeah, if you enjoyed this webinar and you know that you might have had coworkers or collaborators that might enjoy some of what was shared today, if there are people really looking into how do we build up this career pathway to include different voices within this work, this could be a great resource to share for that as well. So yeah, thank you all so much for joining us, and I appreciate you taking your lunch hour to learn a little bit more about our 4 amazing panelists and all the work that they do.